Grounds Academy. Tonight we're going to look at the 2025 5e Monster Manual, and this is the latest and greatest edition that was put out by Wizards of the Coast and adapted for the Fantasy Grounds platform. So without further ado, I'm going to take a look at some of the elements of the new Monster Manual. I've did some research, and it looks like it's kind of a mixed bag on, if people like it or not. There's some controversies, there's some good stuff, there's things that I'm not going to cover. I'm sure you can find it on your own, but what I want to do is focus on the Fantasy Grounds parts of this. And what we're going to see here is in the modules over here on the right-hand side under Library, I have the 2024 settings in Fantasy Grounds set up. So if you have that set, you can use both the older content and the new 2024 content with a little bit more ease. And if you go into the options and you scroll down, you'll see an additions setting that you can set in Fantasy Grounds if you so choose, or if you want to change it. There is this, let's see, where did that go? In here, you can change the edition essentially, and not just for any rule sets, but for 5e. I don't know if, I think Pathfinder 2 might have done it for their, something similar for their new rule set. But essentially you can set that, and it'll change, either you go 2024 or Legacy. That's all I was trying to say here. But anyhow, this is here, it's under game rule version. So this is if you want to switch between Legacy, or if you want to have both Legacy and 2024. So in this case, I have 2024 enabled. I also have all the main rule books now, the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Monster Manual, and the Player's Handbook. So there are some things that have changed from Fantasy Grounds since the last time I did a video about a week ago. I'll go over those in a separate video, but we're going to talk about the Monster Manual. So if I click on the Monster Manual, you'll get your typical links here from Fantasy Grounds, or if you come into the actual books content and you click on the link here for books, and then you open up the Monster Manual link, it'll take you straight to the reference manual or the book for the actual content. So other than the introduction and then an alphabetical index, something I discovered that was interesting is in Appendix B, which is over here at the end, there is a list of equivalents for older Legacy content. So if you were going to purchase this new book and you wanted to know if there's anything that's similar or anything that would kind of be alike, for this it says the appendix for stat blocks have changed between 2014 Monster Manual and this book, as well as lists of monsters organized by habitat, creature type, group, and challenge rating. So there's a different sortings. I don't think that's supported yet in Fantasy Grounds, but I think maybe in the future they'll add it if they think it's necessary. So in other words, when you open up NPCs, up here on the top, you have by letter, by CR, by type. Kind of always wanted it to be sorted also by terrain type, which I think would be kind of a neat thing, but it's not really necessary, but I thought that would be a cool feature. So maybe in the future, or if I put in a request, that can be something that can be done in this particular rule set. I don't know if they'll do it because now you have both the Legacy and 2025, and the Legacy one wasn't set up that way, so I don't know how they would work it. But nonetheless, I thought that would be a cool sorting option. So instead of just having these three, you'd also have it in Fantasy Grounds. But nonetheless, these are the equivalents. So for instance, if you have an Acolyte in the 2014 stat blocks, your equivalent would be a Priest Acolyte in the 2025 equivalent. So that's a nice little chart to have. So anything that's similar or is kind of straight across as far as similarity, this would be the thing to look at. So if you look at a young red shadow dragon, here you have a shadow dragon as the equivalent, or a veteran in the legacy would be a warrior veteran, so on and so forth. So a kipper is now a piranha. What do you know? So there's sort of things that may be different or the same depending on how you want to look at it. And this is a nice reference to have. The other thing they put in here is an animal index. So it says that the index provides stat blocks for animals of the beast type, along with many of the gigantic or mythologicized, is that what they say? Mythologicalized kin in alphabetical order. Most represent versions of animals that exist or existed in the real world. You can find descriptions of these creatures or dictionaries or other educational sources, or you might create new rules for them in your D&D world. So they want you to use stat blocks that are similar. For example, the panther stat block might also represent a mountain lion, so on and so forth. So that's nothing new. That's kind of what they've done before. So another thing I wanted to mention was in the intro, they talk about what's new. So obviously there's 400 monsters or 500 monster stat blocks, and it says there's more of them. Dozens of new ones, including more high-level threats. So they've added some more high-level creatures. They refined the rules a little bit, so every stat block has been updated for ease of use and game balance. They enhanced them, meaning the new stat block and language prioritize details vital to during play, so they've kind of cut some of the other stuff out, I guess. Versatile groups, so non-player characters now appear alongside other monsters and can represent individuals of any humanoid species. They've improved the organization, so now the entire book is alphabetical. Instead of having demon and then have all these separate demons, they actually list each demon by their alphabetical order. There's some expanded lists, such as Appendix B, and every monster in the 2014 Monster Manual appears in this book or has a CR appropriate replacement are detailed in Appendix B. So that's kind of some of the new stuff that they've mentioned. And then when you actually go into the stat block itself, they explain how it's broke down. I kind of like this. So I might do a separate video on this and compare this with the older stat block. But essentially, this is the overview of the stat block, and they kind of detail what each section is about. I kind of like that. It really breaks it down into pieces, and it gives you an idea of what this is supposed to look like in regards to the official 5e format for the 2025 rule set. The monster entries in the back, or the back tab of creatures. So I'm going to pull up, just for example, Goblin Boss. And if you look at this stat block here, you'll notice down here it says version 2024. Here's a stat block. Looks kind of similar. If you go to notes, this is where the monster entries are that they're mentioning. It lists the habitat and the treasures. So habitat is a monster's habitat entry notes, where the monster typically dwells. Lists of monsters organized by habitat appear in Appendix B. Also treasure, so they have a reference for treasure types, whether the monster hoards treasure and the type it prefers. The preferences are detailed as follows. So there's any individual treasure theme, such as arcana, armaments, implements, or relics. The monster treasure hoard features magic items with the noted theme. The Dungeon Master's Guide details treasure hoards appropriate for each theme. And then none. So it doesn't mean I guess it means they don't care about treasure, and anything they would have would be incidental. So there's a narrative description. So after the monster's introductory information comes details that apply to the monster wherever it may be found in the multiverse. Customize these details however is appropriate to your adventures. So you don't have to go with what they put. If there's any special layers, they'll list that. Some creatures will alter the regions like dragons do. And for such monsters, the regional effects are detailed in their lair section. The monster stat block might also include ways in which the monster is more powerful while in its lair. And then the stat block includes at least one stat block. Stat blocks are explored in the next section. So then it goes into detailing what all these things are, the parts of the stat block, your sizes. So all this might be more important and critical if you are someone who's designing content, or you're doing conversions, or perhaps designing your own. So there's some nice tables in here that talks about the challenge ratings and how that goes. Looks like they haven't changed it a whole lot as far as that goes. And then your proficiency bonus ratings and how they do their attacks or damage notations, multi-attack, spellcasting. So the way they have this now is a little different than our typical stat block. So if you find a spellcaster, you'll notice that the spells are a little bit different in regards to how they're set up. So I'm going to just take an example of a goblin, for instance, and you can see that they've added more varieties, but then they also added, or you'll see the more of the changes that are official to this particular edition. So I want to go into the NPCs, and we're going to sort it by letter, or actually I'll just type goblin down here, and you'll see the different varieties of goblins. So you have a boss, a hexer, a minion, a goblin warrior, which I think is your standard goblin variety, or maybe the minion, one of those two. You have a hobgoblin captain, a hobgoblin warlord, and a hobgoblin warrior. So there's some hobgoblins mixed in here too. So at least you have 4 different varieties instead of just 1 or 2. And the neat thing about this kind of reminds me of 4th edition in a way, because you have like the minion, and then you have like, some of the other variations. So let's take a look at the hexer, and we'll go back into looking at the spellcasting trait. So under actions, you really don't have a lot of differentiation as much as you used to anymore. And there has been some pushback or change in regards to how spells are going to be kept track of, regardless of the rule set. I mean, regardless of the platform. So previously there was a way to track how many uses you have, but here all of the spells are at will, and this kind of has a similar format as it would have with the 2014 version, but there's no longer a separate innate one, or that sort of thing. So the spell casting is something that will be a little different in the fact that you don't have them as split up and differentiated. There's not a way to really track how many uses they've had, but this is 1 day each, and then they have this kind of like a special action for the attacks. So you have the goblin makes 2 hex stick attacks. It can replace 1 attack with a use of spellcasting. So the hex stick is kind of like, it does psychic damage, and it has ranged. So that's kind of a cool, different attempt at making attack rolls and showing how that works with the new rule set. So there is some differences in the spell casting I've noticed. If you unlock a character sheet, I've seen this come up a lot on the forums. So you have these little cells here where you can change the modifier and the save. So if you do need to change those, if you simply change the number here under strength, let's say, that's going to apply the appropriate adjustments. So let's adjust this up. However, there are occasions where you'll have to change these and make them higher or lower, and not just the generic one. So if that's the case, you just click on a cell, hold down the control key, and you mouse over the cell or the block, and that will change the value as you need to. So either from the modifier or the save. So again, all you have to do is hover over that cell and take your mouse wheel and roll up or down. And that's how you change those to be different than the defaults. So I'm going to change this back to 8 where it was, and that'll add the generic modifier. But if there's any reason where you might have to increase it, let's say for a boss monster or something, that's how you do it. Also, the resistance and the immunities have been kind of combined. There used to be a bunch of resistances and vulnerabilities and all that stuff. They have changed that in a lot of the newer stat blocks, so it's a little bit more condensed there. And you have your proficiency bonus, which changes with your XP. So I'm trying to think if this one, yeah, so if you change the XP, let's see, 1200, that will change the stuff here. Let me try 3000. Yeah, I think it's a challenge rating. If you change this number here, it's going to change, I believe it'll change these accordingly. So it went up to +3 because I changed the challenge rating to 5. So if you want to change the proficiency bonus, you have to change the challenge rating in this case. And so on and so forth. I don't think XP had anything to do with it in this case. But nonetheless, there are changes that you'll notice in the stat blocks. And if this creature is a summoned creature, so there are some changes to the druids, wild shapes, and if you have like woodland creatures and things that you summon, if you click on that, it's going to change this so that it will inherit the summoner's AC per level based on their DC challenge rating. So if you have like a creature that's supposed to scale with the caster, if you click on the summoned area, this information can be put in depending on what type of caster you have, and it will inherit some of those features depending on what's going on, what type of spell it is, that sort of thing. So summoned creatures have another functionality here that will add or adjust according to the caster's level and that sort of thing. This was introduced, I believe, with the pets or the friend zone. They were doing something like that. I don't know if that still would work with this or not, but nonetheless, that's something you'll have to discover as you're playing. Let's see, what else do we have here? But, the main thing is I like the fact that you have all these options now. There's not just one or two. You have 3, 4, 5 different variations of one of the main creatures. So that's something that may be interesting to you. Being that they left out some creatures, there was a lot of controversy that they cut out orcs and that sort of thing. But the way they handled it is any of the player races, they put them in the player's handbook. So if you wanted an orc berserker, you would just take a berserker stat block and add whatever orc type features you would want. So there is, let's see, let's try a warrior. Let's see if there is such a thing. Yeah, so these are all your different warrior types. You can just take one of those and change it. It's like this warrior veteran would probably work as your orc, and you just change a few features around, and it wouldn't be a big deal. So I think that's part. Maybe they saved a couple pages in their 500 plus monsters. Who knows? But nonetheless, they've changed some things around, and I've done some. Like I said, I did some research, watched some YouTube videos, looked around, read some stuff, and what I'm finding is that the changes they've made aren't incredibly horrible, but there are some people that are enraged because they left out some monsters. And then some of the new monsters are, let's check out that vampire thing. That looked interesting. So let's take a look at the shadow vampire or whatever it was. That thing looked really cool. So here's a vampire, the Umbral Lord, and the Nightbringer. So now you have all these different variations of vampires. You have the vampire familiar. I think that was kind of like what was that, a fledgling or whatever. Vampire Nightbringer, Vampire Spawn, I think that might be the fledgling. And then the Umbral Lord. So let's look at the Nightbringer. So that looks pretty decent. So, sunlight hypersensitivity. So the vampire takes 10 points of radiant damage if it starts its turn in sunlight. While in sunlight, it has disadvantage on attack rolls and ability checks. So it's more of an extreme sunlight sensitivity. It's a hypersensitivity. The vampire makes 1 bite and 1 shadow strike. So that's kind of what they've done with their attack. So instead of arming the monsters with, let's say, a sword, in many cases they have a kind of a themed attack. So Shadow Strike, it does slashing damage plus cold damage, or they might do necrotic damage or something like that. So I think that's kind of cool. So, maybe if you had like a water elemental, that makes more sense to have a themed attack for something like that. But when you have these humanoid creatures that could potentially wield something, having these themed attacks, I think, is kind of a neat thing. It kind of gives that creature some more flavor instead of a short sword with cold damage attached to it or something like that. So now they call it Shadow Strike. It's almost the same thing. But see, in this case, it would be slashing. So instead of maybe a dagger with cold damage, now they have the Shadow Strike, and that gives you the freedom to kind of illustrate or present, like, what is that? Is that claws? Is it a fist? It could be anything. But I think they kind of went with more of a themed kind of thematic attack instead of arming them with typical weapons and such. So that's kind of cool, I guess. In certain situations, it might be annoying, but in other cases, it might be fun. So another thing I want to mention is the artwork. That's one of their selling points. So every creature supposedly has art, which is nice. I thought that was a nice touch. That was probably one of the few things I was excited about, was that they had that, and of course more monsters. Who doesn't like that? So there's your picture, you have your flat token and your camera token, depending on what view you're using. I do like these new notes and all this extra stuff back here. This is kind of what I was going for when I was making my own NPC stat blocks, is you have that habitat, the treasure, you have this little bit of darling, you are simply delicious. So that's from a quote from Astarion, the vampire spawn from Baldur's Gate 3. So this is pretty neat. I like it. And then there's a table here for resting places. So if I click on this, you can decide or roll where the resting place. So this particular one has a space accessible only by shape-shifting, which I think is interesting. So maybe it's a keyhole that you can only get inside of and when you shrink down or when you change your form. That's kind of cool. So really neat approach on various attack rolls. And then, instead of having, a dagger and a sword and all these other things, they just kind of have these themed attacks. And then they have spells too. So that's kind of neat. Let's take a look at a wizard stat block. I want to see what they did to that. So we go to NPCs. Let's take a look at like a wizard or a mage. There isn't really a wizard. Okay, so we got archmage, mage, and mage apprentice. So let's take a look at the mage. So here's your typical wizard type thing. Okay, so there's their spell casting. And it's under actions. It's not a trait anymore. And you got your how many times per day. So that's going to take a little bookkeeping until we can either get an extension or maybe something will change in Fantasy Grounds where we can track that. But you're just going to have to manually keep track of that for now. So you got 3, 2, 1 per day. And then your at-will section. And then you have Arcane Burst. So that's their go-to attack. So that's just like a force damage. It can be either up close or ranged. So again, this is another themed attack for spellcaster or a creature that normally wouldn't hold a sword or something like that. So that's kind of cool. Let's take a look at the notes. So the mage so there's some roles that they may have. Let me see what else they have. They come with a Misty Step. So a reaction, they have protective magic. They can use counterspell or shield in response to the spell's trigger. and they have a bonus action, a Misty Step 3 times per day. So they've kind of broken these things up into almost like abilities and features as opposed to having spells for every single one of these. So that makes sense, I guess. These guys get 3 languages plus common, so that's kind of cool. All right, so it's something that you'll have to get used to a little bit. There's some variations and changes that have occurred between rule sets, but I think all in all, it's not too bad. I mean, if I took all 3 books and chose 3 of them, I'd definitely pick the Monster Manual. That's probably my most monster books, or Tome of Beasts, or any of those are probably like my favorite anyways. And then if you come down, let's see, so I wanted to show something really quick since we're on the topic of NPCs. So this is an image that I had brought up that had it has some creatures on here, and if you're new to Fantasy Grounds or you haven't used it in a while, if you select your, if for instance we're not in combat yet, so I'll go ahead and go to round 1, and when something has initiative, you'll notice this new initiative marker. So whatever creature has initiative on a map, that's or even yourself. So once the initiative gets passed, so go ahead and go down, it'll change this pointer, and you can change those in the settings. So that's something that's kind of new that came out in this next release, and I'm sure they'll have different variations or more options as time goes. And then for dice, if you wanted to, this isn't very new, it's kind of new, but if you wanted to assign dice to this Goblin Warriors, let's say, I want to go into the damage dice or NPC dice. So let's go to NPC dice, and let's go with, let's see, creature type. There's humanoids. Let's see if the goblins are in here. Yeah, so they don't have anything specific right now for goblins. They did have for humanoids. So what you could do in that case is you drag over, let's say, for instance, this Goblin Warrior. Okay, once you have the Goblin Warrior, then you can go through your dice collection if you have these, and you can pick what you want for that particular NPC type. So in this case, under monsters, they have this grave dust. They have the sledge, they have the monster 2. Let's go with this. So there's monsters, there's chitness, there's deep lurkers, avians, bloodstalker, brains. So you could pick one of these themed dice if you wanted to. Let's go with, I like this kind of flora one, or the grave dust looks really cool. And you can pick whatever you want. So maybe you want the toxic skull. Maybe you have a poisoner. Maybe this NPC works with poisons or something. So we can go with the skull toxic burst with effects. So you drag and drop that into that area, and then when you use the actions, or use the actual attack rolls and such, you'll get to use your custom die per creature if you want. And if you want it to be damage specific, then you can change the damage type dice too. So you can get kind of fancy. So now you got these NPC initiative markers, and then you also have the new dice that can correspond with them. So that's kind of cool. So I wanted to show you that it does have some neatness to it. May not be the feature you want, but at least there's change that's in the right direction for sure. So let's take a look at this. Oh, okay, so that's a big tree. That's why it's blocked like that. I don't know if I'd want trees that are going to block like that. I'd probably use glass so they just can't walk through the tree. But it looks like it kind of blocks the map. So I kind of have mixed feelings on maps like that. But anyways, getting off topic. So that's basically some of your 2025 NPC updates in the monster manual. Let me go to images, and let's take a look at, are these going to be in here? No. So what we'd have to do is go to Assets, go to Images, and then you probably have to go through the find the monster manual and open that up to get access to looking at all the different artwork that's associated with the monster manual. So these are just, let's see, Legacy, Monster Manual Assets. Yeah, so like here's all the artwork for these creatures. So if you wanted to look at those as a group, or as as a whole collection, you want to navigate to your folder depending on what books you own and such. So that's pretty cool. All right, so anyhow, that's basically the things I've noticed in the 2024 rule set, and it is a little different than the Legacy. The balance is a tiny bit different, attacks are a little different, spells and magic are handled a little bit differently. How those are going to change between creature to creature, you'll have to discover that through play. I won't be able to go through every single stat block, and make the comparisons, but we could do some on like dragons or something like a boss creature, maybe look at those side by side, but I don't know if that's necessary. I think it's just going to be a matter of time if you even want to adapt to the newer rule set. Some people aren't. They're just going to stay with all the Legacy stuff. That's cool too. No qualms there. And I think that going forward though, this will be a lot funner once there's more content for it. Because right now you have the core book, so I think it's time, if you're going to make content, it's time to start designing. If you have some, adaptations that you want to make, or if you wanted to adjust some of the older content with newer stuff, you could do that. I've seen people getting frustrated. They were like, well, are we going to have, they want like an adventure that was produced in the past to have all the new equivalents. I don't think that's going to happen. You're just going to have to swap those out. So if you have it, let's say you have an encounter, all you'd have to do is just pull up the encounter and swap out the creature types, and then that would help with that part of it. As far as balance goes and the treasure and all that stuff, that's all going to fall upon the game master if they're going to want to make that switch. I don't think I'd change much of it. I just wait till newer content came out or make my own stuff. So anyways, that's just my opinion. But anyhow, folks, take care. You have a good weekend. I'm going to do another video tomorrow, I think, and we'll go over some other things. I think I want to go over the new Fantasy Grounds features, maybe. And then also, I wanted to do a show on the combat tracker. I think it's time to do another one of those. I think there's a lot of good functionality there that most of us don't use or realize. So I think I'll do that first, is do the yeah, no problem, Sambarchi. I think what I'll do is do a new combat tracker with all the new content and see how that plays out, and show the correlation between these options, some of them, and the actual combat tracker, and then see how these creatures and the new characters match up and that sort of thing. So anyhow, folks, you guys take care, have a good one, and I'll see you around next time.